This presentation, Understanding Public Policymaking, introduces several theories that help explain how policymakers make decisions. The theories covered in this presentation include elite theory, group theory, institutional theory, rational choice theory, and political systems theory. Elite theory posits that a small number of elites control public policy. This theory emphasizes how the values and preferences of governing elites influence policy. Uh, these preferences and values often differ from those of the public at large. The assumption of this theory is that the general public is far less influential than elites. The main policy actors in this theory are wealthy people, corporate executives, oil companies, Wall Street investment bankers, and professionals such as physicians and attorneys. Policy actors also include cultural elites, like actors and actresses and musicians. Group theory posits that public policy is a product of a continuous struggle among organized interests. In this theory, power is shared among interest groups, and if one interest group has too much power or does not represent the population well, then a competing interest group will be formed to influence policy. The people who view public policy making from this perspective are often referred to as pluralists. The advocacy coalition framework is a framework within group theory that argues that policy change can occur over time as each coalition uses its resources to change the views or policy beliefs of policy actors. This framework focuses on the interactions of competing advocacy coalitions within a policy subsystem. For example, you might have competing interest groups like the National Education Association and policy think tanks like the Foundation for Excellence in Education competing to influence education policy. The National Education Association has typically been against the formation of charter schools, which are often not unionized, and the policy think tank Foundation for Excellence in Education does advocate for more public school options, including charter schools. So these competing interests then fight with each other to influence education policy within that policy subsystem. Institutional theory emphasizes the formal and legal aspects of government structure. This theory posits that structures and rules make a difference in the kinds of policy process that occurs and which policy actors are likely to influence them. Think about how government institutions influence policymaking. The rules in creating legislation matter. A piece of legislation may look very different if it needs 51 votes from the Senate than if it needs 60 votes. If a piece of legislation needs 60 votes to avoid a filibuster, the ideological positions of those 9 extra senators needed to get to a supermajority will certainly influence the content of the legislation. Rational choice theory is also often called public choice or formal theory. This theory assumes that in making decisions, individuals are rational actors that seek to maximize attainment of their preferences or further their self-interest. An example of this, albeit concerning electoral politics and not exactly public policy making, is something called the electoral connection. The electoral connection argues that elected officials are single-minded seekers of re-election, and that all of their actions can be explained by the fact that they want to be re-elected. This makes intuitive sense because elected officials can't influence policy within a legislative body unless they are working in that legislative body. But at the same time, it is also very simplistic in its view of the motivations of elected officials. Critics of rational choice theory point out that we are not single minded seekers of our own interests. We arguably vote and support policies that are not within our best interest, depending on how we define our best interest, for other reasons. Individuals and interest groups may support policies that don't directly influence them or their members, but because they believe that those policies are morally right. Critics also point out that policy actors, individuals, and groups also often lack information to act rationally. We don't always understand the consequences of a public policy, and it's difficult to determine how it's exactly going to affect us. So at times there's an information issue when it comes to making what we would consider a rational choice. Policy systems theory stresses the way the political system responds and demands. Policy systems theory stresses the way political systems respond to demands that arise from its environment. It emphasizes the larger social, economic, and cultural context in which political decisions and policy choices are made, such as the general preference of Americans for limited government or low taxes. Our culture of individualism helps guide our policy-making decisions. It's important to consider that all of these theories help explain policymaking, but none of them explain everything about policymaking. These theories, along with other theories of the policy process, should be viewed as complements in some ways and competing theories in other ways. Now I'd like to turn our focus to the policy process model. This model posits that there is a logical sequence of activities affecting the development of public policy. This process begins with agenda setting and ends with policy change before starting over again. Agenda setting is how problems are perceived and defined. It's how policy problems command the attention and get onto the agenda. How we define a problem influences how it is addressed on the policy agenda. Is healthcare an issue of coverage or cost? Is the gun issue an issue of freedom or safety? Policy formulation is the design and drafting of policy goals and strategies for achieving them. This step involves policy analysis, where we collect data and analyze it to determine the effectiveness of a policy. For example, we may look at economic forecasts to decide the best tax policies to implement. Policy legitimation involves the mobilization and political support for the formal enactment of policies. It includes the justification or rationales for policy action. Policy implementation is the provision of institutional resources for putting a program into effect within a bureaucracy. Implementation is important because having a policy on paper means very little if the government does not have the mechanism for implementing the policy. Policy implementation deals with questions of what resources are needed to implement a policy, like more money or more employees. Policy and program evaluation involves the measurement and assessment of policy and program effects, including its success and failure. Though similar to policy analysis, this stage assesses the policy outcomes of a policy that has already been implemented. So you do policy analysis to figure out what policies to implement, and then you evaluate those policies after they've been implemented to see what kind of change might need to happen, which leads us to our last step. Finally, there is policy change. In this stage, the modification of policy occurs due to altering policy goals. Perhaps we now want to change the way we look at healthcare or the environment or guns. Lessons from new information, we've now received new information that has changed what policies we think are appropriate for this policy area, or a shifting political environment. Something that was once popular in the past is no longer popular, and so policy change needs to occur. And then once policy change happens, you begin to set the agenda and formulate more policy and analyze policy once again. Obviously, one powerful force in setting the agenda is the media, as you can see from the political cartoon included on this slide.